Today we're blessed to have Paul Beyer with us. He's the executive director of the TomTom Foundation. So we're going to talk about the TomTom Foundation, its mission and goals, and then also talk about their signature festival, which is coming up in just a couple of months, right, Paul?
Yeah, and your daughter's is going to be dancing.
And my daughter, I learned recently, is going to be dancing in it. So this is very personal for me as well. All right, Paul. So what is the TomTom Foundation? What is the purpose and mission of this organization?
Sure. Well, again, thank you for having me. It's really nice to be here this morning. Well, TomTom is we're heading into the 13th annual TomTom Festival, and it has been a staple of Charlottesville. It's 25,000 people each year come out, and there's hundreds of speakers and artists and performers, and there's a lot going on that basically says, let's celebrate Charlottesville, let's celebrate our community, and let's think about the future together. I often get, though, people say, well, what is TomTom? Because even if they've been aware of it and they've seen it, it's a broad event. It's music, art, ideas. It's everything from dancing in the streets. There's ballet performances. Last year's festival started off with a tech conference about AI. There was a sunrise meditation at the reservoir. There was a jail tour and restorative justice conversation about, prison conditions. There was a crowdfunded pitch night, and then there was a silent disco. So it really is intended to be something that is very broad and inclusive in bringing a lot of people into whatever they're passionate about. But the underlying theme is, how does a community get to know each other better and just create a more thriving and vibrant and cultural place?
So it sounds like the main purpose of your foundation, and especially this event, is to generate community, to celebrate community, to strengthen the bonds of community. Why do you consider that so important? I mean, maybe that's an obvious question, but you're dedicating your life to this. Why is the creation of community important to you?
Well, I think that when I started the festival, I was younger, obviously, and I was 30, and I was like,
I thought you were 30 now.
No, I'm 42 now. But when I was, the first event of TomTom was actually my 30th birthday. And the goal at that point in time as a young man or a younger person was to say, how do you make Charlottesville a cultural hotbed? And it was very personal to me to bring art and music and ideas all together and really posit the idea of Charlottesville as an innovative place. Well, now, 13 years later, I think the mission has really deepened, and it is more and more apparent to me, regardless of what's happening in Washington right now. I mean, there's a lot of, that has added a whole other layer to this. But even before the election, we were looking at things like polarization, isolation. COVID really disrupted the way we communicate and talk with each other. The Surgeon General was putting out advisories about epidemics of loneliness. I don't know if you saw that or not, but there's a lot of things that are, for a functioning democracy and a functioning community, you need strong social fabric. And going back to even Robert Putnam back in the early 2000s in Bowling alone, there's these troubling trends of declining church attendance, where the Rotary Club, this Chamber of Commerce, all the things that used to be the civic fabric of a community are somewhat in decline. And so I really see this as a moment where if you get in the national headwinds and the national conversation, it's alienating, it's depressing. How do you make a change? How do you do something? But we have our local community, and there is the cohesion that's here, and there's this very tactical thing that we can do locally, day by day, with our friends and neighbors to create a city where, in a community where people think, oh, we have a shared future. Oh, this person over here may be from a different background from me, but they care about my livelihood, they care about my well-being, and that kind of shared communal awareness is, to me, one of the more important things we can do, because there's a lot of things that are telling us that we're not the same and that we should be more divided. And I think it's a highly tactical, localized question of what's going to be the future.
Yeah. So clearly we have some troubling trends in our country with regard to the breakdown of social institutions. And certainly this is something, as you mentioned, that churches have experienced, but I think it's true in general. And there seems to be a lot of evidence for that. I was just reading recently that men, for instance, have or spend more time alone now than they did 20 years ago, have fewer friends. And so there's a lot of isolation and loneliness in that sense. I imagine that the festival, where you put in a ton of time and energy and resources, really brings people together, and there's maybe a kind of euphoria and a sense of joy that takes over. Oh, that's what you're going for, at least, right? And it's a place where clearly ideas are being discussed, important ideas about the well-being of our community and their celebration. But that's, one week or so in the year, right? One period. How does your organization support community throughout the year? How do you help strengthen the institutions in our community?
Yeah, well, and I think that's a really helpful framing, because one of the things that I get, besides the question, what is TomTom, is when people do think they know what it is, they're like, oh, that's a party downtown where everyone drinks and listens to music. and I will say, there is a part, I think fun is a virtue. I think it's very easy when we get caught up in all of these like eat your vegetable types conversations. It's like, no, I mean like fun and actually enjoying the people that you encounter and having joy is that's the point. There's a real part of this, that's the point. But it's also important to note that Tom is the foundation, TomTom Foundation, like you're alluding to. And we have increasingly tried to just posit the idea that there's this flourish, there's this moment in the year, every year in April, where everyone gets together to think about the future. But it's like the groundwork is laid all year round. So there's 600 organizations that actively participate in our programs every year. And it's intended to be cross-sector, so private sector, government, academia, faith. We've really spent actually a lot of time recently on faith communities. I was talking to Lisa before this, just to say,
we should be there.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, if you think about who leans into a community, it's churches, it's faith communities, it's baked into your mission to care about your community. And then when you think about volunteerism and who actually shows up and does anything, it's actually oftentimes not the young, hipster kids. It's like that are bemoaning everything. It's the institutionalist. So I've really tried to again, part of this deepening of the mission. Like when I was a younger person, I was like, oh, we'll have this hip, cool festival. And increasingly, I'm like, I still want that.
Yeah.
But I really want to layer in this sense that how do you develop a people that care about their community and actually do something.
Right.
And then when they do something, even if you can find a million ways you might disagree with someone, but there's still like that civic virtue of action. It's like celebrate that and commend that and create more of that. That's the point.
Yeah. And it sounds like this maybe is also an opportunity to show people the importance of volunteering and giving back and what you can achieve as a community when you do that. Have you found that as younger people have come, and maybe they weren't the ones who were the institutionalists and didn't volunteer, but they saw what it takes to pull something like this off, has that encouraged some people to be more institutionalist, to use your term?
Well, that's to be determined.
Okay.
I mean, I think one of the things about TomTom that's important to note is there was this thing called COVID. And for the first 10 years of TomTom, we were really aiming to be a national festival, like a South by Southwest. And March 10th, 2020, our press release was Hillary Clinton is going to keynote the festival this year for free. I mean, the festival had grown to the stature that someone like Hillary Clinton was coming to TomTom to speak, and we were not paying her, which is a fairly substantial.
Yeah.
And there were 400 speakers, and there were 300 cities. And the idea was, how do we talk about the future of our hometowns in America? So national aperture. And then, of course, literally the next day, the next press release is, never mind, it's all canceled. And so there were 2 years of kind of trying to figure out what is this next step for TomTom. And I was basically the only person that stayed.
Oh, okay.
And then in 2023, we came back for what was kind of just a different tone to the festival, where we formally defined our name. It now means tomorrow. So it's a festival about the future of this community. So we really stopped talking about this national civic flourishing, and we said, are we actually doing okay with this community? And I think the answer, if you read the paper, is like, no, we're not doing very well with this community. We have a lot of, we still have not repaired from 2017. That is still a major part of the identity and reputation of this city. We do not trust each other. It is very easy to see you could just have seen the city council meetings for a few years, and it was very fractious. And it really occurred to me that I was talking about like the national relevance of Charlottesville, and I was like, we haven't even figured out this place.
Right.
So that became the focus the last 4 years, is to just say, how do people be friends? How do we have empathy and learn from other people? How do we still have vision? Because you can't just be in a negative space. Like, you have to have some positive thing that you're going to, or else what's again, it's like, what's the point? So, yeah.
Well, maybe that's a good segue, Paul, to talk about the events, the content, the idea sharing that's going to happen in this year's TomTom Festival, and how you're hoping to address some of those local community issues. Is there anything you want to share on that with us? Or
sure. And I'm realizing that I keep going like this, so hopefully you all are hearing me
still. It's all right.
still.
Just speak loudly then.
Yeah. I'll just put this up because the theme this year is evolve. So we've been doing themes. Last year the theme was together. This year the theme is evolve. And to me, this is kind of funny because this is I choose the theme. And I've just been thinking a lot about how do we evolve as individuals, as businesses, organizations, as communities, as society. And again, what's unique about TomTom is it's kind of a civic ritual where everyone comes together and thinks about the same thing. And so I really have liked this idea of how do we adapt, how do we grow, the way we think, and just that ripple effect through the larger systems of society. So that's the theme this year. And some people will be just coming and evolving as they drink a beer, and many other people will be doing something.
You meet people where they are, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's 170 events at TomTom. 97% of them are free or pay what you can. So meaning, let's make this as accessible as possible. The Evolve Conference is kind of the heart of the intellectual experience of TomTom. This year, we're doing a new program called Civic Futures, and it's going to look at questions of democracy, the innovation economy, and then how actual coalitions develop to do anything in a city. So that's something that's a pretty broad, idea, and it might be of interest to many of you. Then there's technology and entrepreneurship days, and then there's a society and wellness day. It is, of course, Easter Sunday, so that is the only. That's the only we have moved this to Earth Day, so it's This time it happens to overlap with Easter. But I would really like to see more church and faith communities use TomTom as a week where everyone gets together to talk about the issues that matter the most. And I could see, is TomTom a time when churches could visit each other's congregations, or could there be maybe don't mess with Sunday or don't mess with Saturday, but is there like a Wednesday night social where faith communities could come talk about, the contributions that they're each making to the community?
Absolutely, yeah.
Anyway, there's a lot of opportunity with TomTom. Then there's a downtown mall block party. There's community partner programs. There's 50 events that are actually just led entirely by the community. And we kind of say to them, look, this is a festival about the future, but this is not TomTom's version of the future. This is your version of the future. So what do you see? What do you see this community becoming? And then here's the microphone. You tell it. So the last few years, last year was 50 plus organizations did this. Right now we're at 40. And this would be a great example of something where it's like, how does St. Paul's talk about the future of this community? Obviously, clearly you have an engaged audience here, and you all are doing that every Sunday.
Yeah. Well, that raises a question for me. Do you have faith leaders as speakers at the conference portion, or a kind of a presence at the night activities? Do you already have that lined up? Have you had that in the past, or is this an area where you're trying to really stretch and grow?
This is a growth area.
Okay.
I think in the opening years of TomTom, when it felt like tech entrepreneurship, and then there was hometown innovation, again, for whatever reason, I think oftentimes conversations about planning and policy and things like that, it tends to skew more left. And then there's like, okay, so for whatever reason, it's like, it never occurred to me to like really intentionally bring faith communities into the conversation. And then in the last few years, I've increasingly looked at this as a spiritual enterprise in the sense that it's a value-based organization that's about connecting people around shared values and shared future. It's a spiritual exercise. Right. So it's like, I need to bring the spiritual people into this conversation. You know?
It's really interesting, Paul. It makes me think about how I think often in our society, we have a lot of really important public policy questions, technology questions, societal issues, and we look to various people to offer guidance to us.
Right.
But when you think about the people that are offering guidance, they have a lot of technical knowledge in whatever the different fields are, but they're usually not people who have thought very deeply about values, about different spiritual perspectives, about different ethical norms and frameworks. In a way, they haven't thought philosophically about a lot of these questions, as they're so in the details of. But there are a lot of kind of implicit values, implicit assumptions about what we ought to do. I think an example for me is the way that some of the tech people talk about transhumanism, for instance, and this idea of wanting to sort of live forever, and could we do this and all this, without realizing, that religious people and philosophers have been thinking about those kinds of questions for thousands of years, right? So I wonder if that's maybe what you're getting at too, is that there needs to be the presence of people who don't just think about technical details about how to bring things about, but think about framing, values, ethics, norms. What is the good life, right? Like, why are we here, right?
How do you do it?
How do I do it? We do it here every Sunday. I know.
But what is it? You sit with a congregation of people, so what is it that you're motivating, animating philosophy for eliciting that?
Oh, sure, yeah. Well, as Christians, our purpose, our perspective on life is that we find our ultimate fulfillment, our ultimate meaning in God, which God is just another way of saying truth, beauty, love, goodness. These things aren't attributes of God. They are the very essence or being of God. and that you aren't going to find your true fulfillment, your true purpose, that deep sense of peace, if you attach your ultimate end to anything in this world, right? So it's not to say that like the partying at Tom Tom is bad. I mean, Jesus had a big party at the wedding at Cana, right? I think I heard recently he brought 30 cases of wine, if you think about all the water that was turned to wine. But a Christian's going to say, you're not going to find true peace in hedonism and partying, right? It may be temporarily pleasurable and good, but it's not the ultimate good, right? We use a Latin phrase for this, the summum bonum, the greatest good. I think that's our fundamental framing. And it is in many ways what so many people in our culture are missing, right? They are attaching their sense of meaning and purpose to things in this world which are not ultimate, right? So that would be my simple summary framing. We teach and preach and live this in a variety of ways, like our conversation today, preaching in the service, the liturgy every Sunday reminds people of this. But it's a journey, right? Because I'm just as tempted as everybody else in this society to put my ultimate trust and faith in power, fame, glory, pleasure, whatever the different things are in this world. That's my short answer to your very good question about what is the good life.
Well, no, that's part of the question, but the other part of the question is that you part of, I think, the Christian worldview is taking people in their vocations and asking them what's the deeper meaning to what they're doing,
right?
And how do they infuse the values that of Jesus into their day-to-day activity?
Yeah, absolutely. We use a word that I don't know if it's used as much anymore in like general conversation, but we use all the time the word vocation.
Yeah.
Right. It comes from a Latin verb, vocare, which means to call.
Yeah.
So that what you're doing, like I'd look at your life and I would say, Paul, what you're doing is not a job. It's not fundamentally a paycheck. It's a vocation.
Yeah.
Right? I don't know if you even get paid for it, but it's a vocation, right? I mean, it is what you believe you have been called to do. Now, there's an implicit assumption in that, isn't there, that somebody is calling you to do that, right? And for Christians, that would be God. But I think the word vocation captures that greater sense that this is what it means to live a meaningful, purposeful life, right? And I don't know that we do a good job of that in our society of helping people think, what is your vocation? What is your calling? Christians will speak of the ways in which we are all gifted with different spiritual gifts, right, by the Holy Spirit, and we are called to use those gifts for the common good, essentially the building up of community. So that's, I think, how we would frame that question.
I think that maybe one of the commonalities here is everyone has busy lives.
Absolutely.
And you've got kids, you've got all these obligations, there's stressors.
Right.
And then what is nice and I think the beauty of church or this sort of ritual every Sunday is to kind of return to some kind of deeper connection to why you're doing what you're doing.
I think that's well said. Yeah.
And I think Tom is once a year to
It's a
say,
ritual,
hey, let's get together and think about why we're doing what we're doing.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I mentioned the kind of, sorry, this is the, wait, good gracious. Do I really not have the one slide I want? Okay. Yeah. Well, we're a values-based organization. So a few years ago, we published just a values statement. And they were values like humility, friendship, belonging, fun, experimentation. They were like kind of the governing ethos of why we're doing what we're doing. Yeah. And I mean, I think the things that I kind of cue into are, I think, humility. Like if you're talking about bringing community together, the question is why don't we get together? Well, some part of it is that we we lose sight of that. That's like, it's a muscle you have to develop and you have to work it. It's not just going to happen naturally. It's very easy to be family and then have concentric circles of who you care about. And like, I think one of the things with Christianity is saying that is not your awareness. The awareness needs to start with
who's your neighbor?
Who's your neighbor?
Right?
Yeah.
Right.
So I think with TomTom, one of the things that I've been really thinking about is, well, what does that mean? Well, humility is one of those governing virtues because, like start with curiosity, start with what you don't know about the next person. And if you can really bake that in, which with TomTom, that's what we've really tried to do is, like this is a complicated society. I'm a white guy, running a nonprofit in Charlottesville in a city, having gone through August 12th in 2017, and like there's a lot of distrust and animosity, sometimes just based on who you are and how you present and what people think you are and what they project onto you. And I think for me, I've been really thinking about how do you not be reactive? Because we're really trained to be reactive. If someone says something mean to us, you're immediately like, oh, hit back, punch back, or be defensive or whatever it is, and it's like, well, how can you be humble and actually hear what they're saying, not take it personally, and then create a space for them to see a different side of you.
Yeah.
And then likewise, just allow them the space to share where they are. And I think that's been a pretty large part of TomTom the last 4 years.
Yeah. Yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, it certainly is in line with the Christian vision for sure. It's interesting we're talking about this. The gospel reading that we're going to hear at church in a few minutes, Jesus says, "Love your enemies." Right? Just happens to be the gospel appointed for this Sunday. Loving your enemies is an incredible statement, isn't it? But what it means is that you see in that other person something of the image of God. Right? You can see that this person has dignity and worth, even if you have a radically different perspective about reality, even if that person has harmed you in some deep and significant way, that there is the possibility for transformation, for reconciliation, for community, if we can see the innate humanity in one another. It sounds like that's at the core of what, you wouldn't put it probably like that, but that's at the core of what you're about.
It's a big part of it.
Yeah.
I think what was intriguing is that I had kind of a late in life spiritual reawakening. I grew up in the church, so I was very religious until I was 20, and then I had a bit of a departure from it, just for a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
And then around when I was 38, I just realized, oh my goodness, I'm sitting here running this community festival that's all about community and spirit, bringing connection to people, and I've been allowing the baggage from my youth to like really define what I thought spirituality was. And I was giving it undue power, and it was not necessary to give it that power. I'd thrown the baby out with the bathwater.
Interesting.
And then so it was just sort of like, oh, all right, this, like TomTom needs to speak about spiritual values because it is bringing people together and convening people is a spiritual enterprise. And it's around deeper truths and trying to find what's best in people, and that's what I do.
Yeah.
And I had been very hesitant. I did not want to ever speak. For the first 10 years, I think that had been like one of the big kind of disconnects. Did you worry that it would
alienate people, or?
I think I would worry I'd alienate myself.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And and so as a result, we were doing all these really cool things of let's elevate culture, let's elevate the innovation ecosystem, let's do all these things that are, I think, good.
Yeah.
You want to live in a city that's vibrant and cultural and well planned and beautiful, and all those things are totally fine. But the underlying reason for any of those things is hopefully a community that is interconnected and cares about each other.
Right.
And if you don't have that as an animating impulse, there can be a certain hollowness to the other proceedings.
That's well said, Paul. Yeah. I wonder, I mean, it's interesting that you've kind of shared your own journey on this. I wonder if you might share some of the reasons why you felt that the spiritual way of life or the spiritual perspective wasn't resonating with you when you were younger. Because that may be some insights into how others in the community feel about that.
Yeah.
And do you think we have a kind of a crisis in terms of people in our community not being grounded in spirituality and values? Like, are we missing that as a community in some deep sense?
That's a huge question.
Yes, it is.
That's a big one.
We only ask big questions here.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me personally, I was a very academic, bookish person. So I was like reading theology when I was in high school and just like really, really intense.
Yeah.
And I just had a few experiences where I realized it was kind of making me very judgmental. And I had a few relationships that really kind of imploded because of this sort of like performative, critical, judgmental experience. And then I went to New York, and New York is not necessarily the bastion of, Christian thinking. And so there was just a period where I was like, what is serving me? And is it this and all of that? So I think that was a pretty intense experience of just when you can be governed by judgment. And there's certainly parts of religion that can really lead you to think, I know this is the dogmatic truth,
right?
And I feel like it's really like a dogma, and I think people are they're skeptical. They don't want to be told, there's always this sense of like, well, what's your ability to think critically and to think for yourself?
Yeah.
And I think the moment that people feel like that's being shut off by a certain, belief system, they're just like, well, I don't know.
Yeah.
And then I think too, our culture as a whole is, we're a consumer culture.
Yeah.
Like we're fundamentally, I mean, we're fundamentally not aligned in some respects with this deeper care and sensibility to your neighbor.
Yeah.
And so that is a pervasive, belief. And so finding those touch points, I mean, that's why religion and spirituality and churches and anything that gets people to think beyond their day-to-day needs and desires and all of that into something that's to the greater whole is like, celebrate that. That needs to be celebrated all day long.
Yeah. So I heard two, I think, really important values and themes in what you just said there that sort of, I think, have grown out of your own experience with religion. And one is that sense of humility, right? Or curiosity, which you've kind of come to at several points here. That really we're called to be open to looking at the world in a variety of different ways, learning from one another, seeking the truth in the deepest sense that we can, as opposed to just kind of saying, well, this is the way it is, and imposing it on people in some sort of authoritarian, I should say, way. And it seems to me that the church has often failed to do that throughout its history, failed to be humble, right? And in a sense, lead people into those deeper truths. I like thinking about it as sort of telling a better story, because that's what it is, right? We're hearing all sorts of stories all the time about what the good life is, the meaning of life, its purpose. Does the church tell a better story? And how are we narrating that story? And I think often we're just not doing a good job of telling that story in a way that draws people into it, right? And transforms their life. So I feel like that's at the heart of what you're talking about here, is like this openness to kind of learn from one another. And if the church was willing to be better about that, about telling its story in a way that was not imposing it on people, then maybe people would see the beauty in it.
Well, I think there's so much beauty to it.
Yeah.
I mean, I was even thinking about it this morning. It's like I could think of a dozen biblical passages that are, even when I was not, I don't think I ever would have said I was an atheist, but I would have been like, I'm just severely agnostic, and I'm not wanting, and I'm disengaged.
Yeah. Right.
Like, I'm not interested in this conversation. Right. So, like, if you'd asked me at 28, I'd been like, I am not interested in this conversation.
Right.
But then, like the values and I mean, that's just it with Christianity and with teachings of Jesus. I mean, they're transformative, like revolutionary teachings that you can read them today and obviously, and I mean, you can come to them cold and be like, oh my goodness, that's unbelievable.
Right.
And there's this radical call to identify with people that are not yourself and to care for them and then to make meaningful sacrifices. I mean, just the idea of meaningful sacrifice to not do what is in your interest in order to help someone else is like, that's the sauce right there. I mean, that's it. So that has been a prevailing thought, even when I would have said intellectually, I'm an agnostic.
Right.
Right.
And the sense, it sounds like, of having rituals and having spaces where you intentionally create opportunities for people to be engaged. I think that's another challenge, right? In our society, we've talked about the loneliness epidemic, but also we have a lot of forces, especially in the tech side of things, that are really pushing us into these echo chambers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even echo chambers of the kind of entertainment that we pursue, right? I mean, there once was a day, not all that long ago, when you and I were younger, where we would have seen the same TV shows and movies, and we would have had that kind of common cultural frame of reference, and we could talk about it, right? And debate it and discuss it and so forth. That's much less true now, right? Because people can watch whatever they want on Netflix or Prime or Apple or whatever. And so how do we create, because I think we have to create them. They're not just going to happen in the way that they did maybe in the past, more organically. How do we push against that atomization, that isolation, and create, like you're doing here with this event, more opportunities for people coming together who don't already see things the same way, right?
Yeah. I think there's a really good book called The Art of Gathering. And is anyone familiar with this book, The Art of Gathering? No, that is actually way louder. I hope you guys have been able to hear me. Sorry about that. The Art of Gathering is a book by Priya Parker. And it sort of walks you through this sort of empathetic imagination of like when you are getting people together, when you are gathering them, what is the core needs that you're meeting for them? What's the experience you want them to have? And that kind of deep empathy and intentionality to bringing people together is like it's like a revolutionary thing. And I think one of the things that I like use as just the back of the envelope is I've run events now for 13 years. There's hundreds and thousands of people that have come to events that I throw. And I've had empty rooms and I've had full rooms. And it's fine. You can tell when there's energy behind a conversation. Energy is such a powerful thing. When people want to be there, they want to be engaged, they're having fun, they're enjoying themselves. It's like you can tell when there's energy, and it's totally apparent when it's not there. Yeah. And the thing is if you can find energetic points and then bring them together and combine them, that's the thing. It's not trying to like bring diversity and inclusion or any of those things just for the sake of that.
Yeah.
It's like, no, find what really ignites people and do that. you know, and if possible, and the most recent example is we just did we do dance parties through the year and as fundraisers, and we just did a dance party called Body and Soul, and it had 2 stages, and one was like an R&B stage and a soul stage, and the other one was a funk and house stage. And funk and house are a little bit more white leaning, and then R&B and soul is a little more black leaning. And people came to this party and they were like, this is the most diverse thing we see, you know. It's because we were creating these nodes that people naturally were attracted to, and we weren't trying to say, oh, go listen to this and come see what I want. And instead, it's like we gave both options, and then we put them in proximity. And then because they're in the same venue, people were constantly walking back and forth and just rubbing shoulders with each other. And I mean, again, like I think it's funny talking about a dance party here at church, but you know, but it is like finding those things. And you know, I'd be curious, like in your example, it's like, well, do you have companion congregations that are Black and Latin and things?
Yeah, I mean, we do actually have a partnership with a Black Baptist church down the road. One of the challenges in this particular area is there is not a huge amount of racial diversity. It's different in that sense from the city. But yeah, we seek that out, not just racially, but across denominational lines as much as possible too. Yeah.
Well, I mean, co-creating, I mean, this is where it's like my event. I mean, taking my Tom hat off and just my citizen hat.
Yeah.
It is like, Sunday morning is one of the most segregated hours in America.
Right.
And it's like, well, what is it that actually brings communities together across race and class on Sunday morning? And maybe not Sunday morning. Maybe it is. Like I don't think these things have to be forced.
Right.
But it's like, if not Sunday morning, Wednesday night. Or whenever you have weekly socials and church dinner. I remember this from my church going youth, you know. Like, what is it that actually finds that commonality? And both congregations are showing up because they want to.
Right.
And that's, I don't have the answer. I don't have any idea.
Yeah, I think the idea you're talking about, though, is you take energy points, right, where there's already a lot of energy, and you put them in proximity to each other. That's a really interesting idea, right, to think of it in those terms. Let's open it up to questions, though, because there may be some questions for Paul. Any questions for Paul today? Yes. Funding and attendees.
Yeah. So in terms of funding, I mean, I mentioned it's 97% free or pay what you can. So we rely very heavily on sponsorship and philanthropy and grants. And I've been trying to figure out how that ticket, you know, how the earned revenue comes in a little bit more strongly, because pre-pandemic, I mean, we're still operating at a third the budget we did pre-pandemic. And I keep, so there's been a change in that landscape of the sponsorship and grant making landscape. And then now with what's happening in Washington, there's like definitely some, like I'm going into this April being like, oh, okay. We're going to evolve in more ways than one. So that's the funding. And I will say, it's 25,000 people. The budget for the festival is 500,000, and there's another 250,000 of in kind. So when I tell people this, anyone that runs events goes, you throw a 25,000 person festival for $500,000. It's like it's pennies on the dollar. But it's just, the point is if you get enough people to believe in something and everyone wants to contribute, then it's just less of a lift. The other thing was attendees and diversity. Well, again, I think it's about create. That's why I mentioned like the festival started with a tech conference, jail tours with restorative justice conversations, sunrise meditation, and then a crowdfunded pitch night. The most diverse night is actually the crowdfunded pitch night, because we really make a priority of elevating entrepreneurs that may not have traditional access to funds. And we partner with a number of organizations that are going to bring diverse audiences. It kind of comes back to like that energetic point. It's like, can you find those commonalities and then actually serve the partner so that their needs are met? And we do them like we do that with 600 organizations each year. But I think the aggregate is a very diverse event. And some events are more and less, depending on like what the focus is. And yeah.
Awesome. Well, Paul, I think we've come to the end of our time, but I want to thank you very much for being with us today. Let's give Paul a round of applause. And do attend the Tom Tom Festival this year.
Yeah.
Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Thanks be to God.